You're listening to Mornings with Eric and Brigitte here on Moody Radio 89.3.
Talking with family members who have questions and maybe even some doubts about the Christian faith. Hopefully doesn't get contested with you. Sometimes it can be. Eric, I don't know if you've experienced that, but at times people really do have honest questions. Sometimes they can be a little bit combative. You can either experience one or the two.
I was about to say honest is one thing. Skeptic to the point of arrogance almost is another thing. I think there can be two different ways of looking at this, right? And it's you must be crazy or I have a few questions. It can come at you either way, I think.
Yeah, and my husband and I actually were out the other day, and Matthew Mittelberg is joining us from Apologetics Inc. here. And, we ran into a lady. My husband's an evangelist at heart, so we actually engaged her in conversation. He shared a little bit of his testimony, and her response was, I'm just too scientific to really believe. Oh, wow. And the good news is she has had other Christians who have been witnessing to her. And so, you know what? God's on the move, obviously, in her life. But when you run into someone who says, I just have intellectual beliefs, I'm sure that's something as an apologist you've heard many times.
Yeah, absolutely. When I talk about the historical evidence for the resurrection or I talk about evidence for miracles, sometimes people just say, no, I have a scientific mindset. I can't believe in these things. But what I want to say is if you have a scientific mindset, you should follow the evidence wherever it leads, not sort of close off yourself to supernatural explanations and believe that the only things that exist are the natural world. That's sort of like putting blinders on before you go and you look at the scientific data. Actually, when we look at the evidence, there's an incredible amount of evidence that points to the reality of the resurrection and to miracles more generally as well.
Let me just say, okay, if we're going to do science, I like 100% of things, right? 100%, people die, they die. I mean, that's you're given, you're born, you die. That's kind of what it is. People just don't rise from the dead. Explain that one to us.
Yeah. This is something that I hear often when I talk about the resurrection. And I was at a roundtable discussion in England, and we were all having a great conversation about this. And one guy kind of just stood up at one point, and he was just like, dead bodies stay dead. End of story. And we all kind of like, whoa, this is a strong statement. But the problem with that is, number one, it's like, yeah, that's the whole point is, yeah, dead bodies do normally stay dead. So when one doesn't stay dead, that's how we know it's a miracle. That's how we know what we're talking about. We're not saying this is some sort of natural phenomenon that dead bodies suddenly don't stay dead. No, we're saying this is a special exception to the ordinary course of nature. That's what a miracle is. And how would we know what a miracle is unless there is some sort of regularity? And the point is, if there is a God, he's created the universe. He's created these regularities. He's created life itself. What's the problem with him changing things? What's the problem with him creating an exception to the way that things normally operate? If there is a God, that's completely possible to happen.
So how do we know that this dead body didn't stay dead?
Yeah, Jesus himself, yeah. Well, there's great historical evidence. I know you guys interviewed Paul Copan, Dr. Paul Copan, one of my professors at Palm Beach Atlantic University in philosophy of religion. And when we look at the historical evidence, there is an amazing amount of information that points to the resurrection of Jesus. He was dead on the cross. His body was gone from the tomb 3 days later. He was seen by the apostles, and this was all reported within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. And these are historical facts that even the large majority of historians will agree to about the historical Jesus. And you have to ask the question, what sort of explanation can fit all of that data? And the only explanation that really explains all of it is that Jesus actually rose from the dead. In fact, it's the explanation that I think most naturally fits the data itself. And the only reason to reject it is if you want to just say, well, that couldn't have happened, or, I just don't believe that miracles can happen. And then we're back to this question of why wouldn't you want to believe in a miracle in the first place?
Yeah, I was listening to something yesterday, and the guy said other people have objections, and there are quite a few different ideas for objections, but every one of them kind of fall apart so that to the point, yeah, that objection kind of makes sense, but it eventually falls apart. The only one that doesn't fall apart is the resurrection.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think that a lot of objections to miracles are fundamentally circular. They sort of rely on the conclusion to state their premise. So, for example, to say that miracles are impossible because no one's ever seen a miracle before. Well, you're assuming the very thing that you're trying to claim in the very first place by saying no one's ever seen a miracle before. And dead bodies stay dead. Well, you're assuming that dead bodies stay dead when you say that. And so a lot of these sort of miracle objections just seem to be circular. And that doesn't mean that they're false, but it doesn't mean that we have any reason to really believe that they're true.
Okay, so another question might be just the law of nature. A miracle would violate that, wouldn't it? I mean, a law is a law for a reason when we talk about nature. So how can we believe in something that completely kind of goes over that?
Yeah, I hear this one a lot because people kind of have this mindset about the laws of nature, that they're these unbreakable things, that they describe how the world operates. But I like to say I think that's a misunderstanding of how the laws of nature actually operate. They are descriptive, not prescriptive. So they describe the way that things usually happen, but they don't prescribe. It's not like there's some law out there that says you have to do this or you have to do that. Like, for example, the law of gravity. If I were to drop a pen, the law of gravity says it's going to hit the ground. But if I reach in and I catch it before it hits the ground, did I just break the law of gravity? No, all I'm doing is I'm stopping the ordinary course of events, and I'm intervening. Now, I'm using natural means to do that, so I'm not performing a miracle. But if God's created the law of gravity, there's no problem with him stopping that pen in midair and saying, you know what, this time I'm not going to apply gravity to that pen. I'm going to stop things from happening. So it's not as though nature is broken or the universe would implode if a miracle were to occur. Like, if God has created everything, he is holding all things together, and there's no problem with him intervening.
I was thinking of Mission Impossible when Tom Cruise is falling,
love it.
and he just stops right before the floor.
Yep.
Right, that's he defied the law of gravity.
Yep.
There was a rope helping him, but he defied the law of gravity.
Yep.
All right, so what if all these disciples got together and they made a plan and they said, "This is what we're going to tell"? What if they were actually lying about this? Somebody might say, you say there are miracles today or back then or whenever, and it's just people getting together and making up something so that we can believe or have some idea of belief.
Well, in order to do something like that, in order to have a conspiracy, you have to have something to gain. And when we look at the disciples, they had absolutely nothing to gain and everything to lose by claiming that Jesus rose from the dead, claiming that he was the Messiah. There's an excellent Babylon Bee sketch where the disciples say, what if we just pretend like Jesus rose from the dead so that we can all get persecuted and murdered for our faith? And they're all like, yeah, let's do this, and one guy's like, are you guys crazy? I don't want to do that. Like, they're like, no, shut up. We're gonna do this. and I think that really makes the point that, the disciples had nothing to gain and everything to lose by claiming that Jesus was the Messiah. In fact, the book of Acts describes how they were kicked out of the synagogues. They were beaten. They were abused by the religious leaders. And the early church faced so much persecution for the belief that Jesus was God. And so a conspiracy has to have something to gain. In the same way, many of the miracles that we see today, the miracle reports, come from people who have everything to lose. They don't have everything to gain. No one's, giving you a job promotion for claiming that you've experienced a miracle. And if anything, they're going to look at you like you're crazy if you say that you've been healed or if you say that you've experienced something miraculous. So I just don't think that objection really stands up to scrutiny.
I even think we hear of a lot of Muslims now who are seeing, or they're talking about dreams and visions and things like that.
Yeah.
They have nothing to gain from that. They have everything to lose for that.
Absolutely. They have persecution. That's what they look forward to. And yet there's a book, Tom Doyle, Visions and Dreams, where it describes how these Muslims are experiencing so many visions and dreams of Jesus. And he's telling them where to meet a Christian or telling them where they can find a Bible. And they're becoming Christians on the basis of these visions and dreams. And I think it just shows how much God loves these people, that he is appearing to them personally and guiding them towards him.
So let me ask one other question, though, that kind of doesn't It takes us, I guess, to the next point of, then why? Why would they, if they're not lying, if they knew that there was going to be persecution, they didn't fully know, but Christ told them they would, this, same thing would happen to you, right? Why would they do this? Why would they give up their life for Christ?
I think it's because they realized that they don't just believe that Jesus is the Messiah. They don't just believe it intellectually. They placed their faith and their trust in this person. They believed him when he said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. And they put their faith and their trust in him, not only as a religious leader or a teacher or a rabbi, but as a savior. And they were willing to die for their belief because they realized who Jesus was, that he is able to even save them from death and raise them to new life as he was raised to new life himself. And I think that's exactly what he calls us to do too. He doesn't call us just to intellectually assent to a philosophical proposition that there is some sort of higher power in the universe. No, he's inviting us into a saving relationship with him based on what he's done for us. And I think that's exactly what we should do.
Yeah. And so if we meet someone like the young lady I mentioned at the beginning who says, I just have, a scientific mind and I really just can't believe because I'm too rational. I think that's the word she used. And we answer their questions. Do you think that's going to be enough? Or how do we approach someone with that kind of mindset?
Yeah, I don't know if it's going to be enough, just because people like to think that they are perfectly rational beings, and yet in reality we have our own desires, we have our own worldviews that are influenced by what we want to be true. And so what I want to talk to somebody who says something like that is, I think there's kind of two ways of being open-minded. There's the open-minded where you're so open-minded that you're open to anything and you're really not open to anything. Yeah. You're just sort of like, I'm not going to make a decision. I'm going to kind of go on with my life and not really think about this. And that's not really a pursuer of truth. I think the better open-mindedness and the better rational person is the person that says, you know what, my eternity is at stake here. I need to figure out who God is. I need to figure out what is the afterlife, and I need to make sure that I am right with my maker. And so I'm going to pursue that truth. I'm going to investigate. I'm going to find out what is real no matter what. And so I would encourage that person, have you really looked into the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus? If not, here's The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel. Let me give you this book. Let me help you to think through this in a new way.
One of my favorite lines of rock music is, you're so open-minded that your brain leaks out. And that's what you're talking about. Yeah. Okay, so, but you're talking to that person, you say, I've got a book I want to give you, Lee Strobel. But before I give you that book, here are some evidences. What would you say to that person in just a few moments you have with them over coffee?
Yeah, so if they want to talk about the resurrection, I would talk about some of those things that I talked about earlier, that Jesus was dead on the cross, his body was gone from the tomb, he was seen by the apostles, and this was all reported within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses, and just say, how do you explain that outside of the resurrection of Jesus? If it was to be more just broadly about God and the reality of God and the possibility of miracles, I would point to, there was a Barna study done in 2016 where they interviewed 1,000 American adults, and they asked them, have you experienced something that can only be described as a miracle of God? And nearly 2 out of every 5 said, yes, I have. And if you extrapolate that data to the country, that means that over 93 million Americans have experienced something that can only be described as a miracle of God. Now, is it likely that all 93 million of them are either lying or mistaken? Right? I don't think so, right? I think the evidence shows that if even one of them is being truthful, if even one of them is correct, that proves that miracles are not only possible, but that they happen. And I think that's excellent evidence for the reality of God.
Well, you mentioned The Case for Christ as a resource. The website that you're part of, Apologetics Inc. or apologetics.org, is also, I bet, a great place to go.
Absolutely. We've got articles on our website talking about the historical evidence for the resurrection. We've got podcasts. We've got YouTube channels. I've got a YouTube channel, so always encourage people to like and subscribe. And that's a great resource as well, apologetics.org.
All right. We're going to make sure there's a link at our website, ericandbrigitte.org, so you can get there and get all that information. This is a time of year where we have the opportunity to talk to people about the resurrection, just like we have the opportunity to talk to people about, Christ came during Christmas. This is Christ came. Why? This is the answer to why for that rescue project that you were talking to us about. So thank you so much for coming in. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much, guys. Appreciate it.
Here's Katie Nicole.